This week on The Futurists, Captain Scott Kelly.
Earth, even from the space station, looks like this oasis in space. And I would imagine looking at Earth from the distances of the moon, especially when Earth is behind the moon and you could no longer see it, you realize just how wonderful and incredible and fortunate we are to have this planet. And we are all on it together, and we all need to take care of it. And, you know, we are much more interconnected than we think.
Welcome to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, and this week we have the privilege of having Captain Scott Kelly, retired NASA astronaut, return to the studio, and we're going to talk about all things space, particularly Artemis II mission, the upcoming plans for NASA to put a moon base on the moon, and what it would be like, training in this age of NASA's manned spaceflight exploration. Scott Kelly, welcome back to The Futurists.
Thanks, Brett.
Last time I saw you was in Dubai in September. How have you been?
Good. That was in September? This past September?
Yeah,
Wow.
September 23rd and 24th.
Man, time flies.
Absolutely. Have anything interesting been happening?
To me, personally?
Yeah. Any interesting trips? Or?
Let me think. After Dubai, I went to India, gave a talk there. India is always fascinating for various reasons. No, not much. I mean, I still travel a bit. I went to the Artemis launch. That was exciting.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. That was
and what's it like? Because there's a pretty big spacecraft comparative to the shuttle, right? Taller, right?
It's taller. And it's interesting because right after the launch, I had this conversation with my wife, and then actually my brother was there and we talked about it. And being there, watching it in person was impressive, not because it was bigger, but because of where it was going.
Right. Yeah.
Visually, acoustically, with like acoustic vibrations and stuff, very, very similar to the space shuttle. But I found that even though this was a first flight of this rocket and capsule with people on it, this configuration, a lot of the parts were shuttle parts, tank, engines,
and stuff,
solid rocket motors were all, pretty well understood and had flown on Artemis I, obviously. The capsule never had people in it before, but, we know how to build those. And the fact that the emergency escape assist, it has an emergency escape system, and when you're on the top of the rocket, it's, if there was a catastrophic failure, your chances of survival are much higher than on the space shuttle. So I found watching a space shuttle launch, I was much more anxious than Artemis.
Because the shuttle is the emergency escape.
Yeah, because you're on the side of the vehicle. And if, something goes wrong, it's kind of hard to get off the stack, the external tank and the solid rocket motors, and still make it to the ground.
Yeah.
My brother felt the same way. We were more anxious actually watching a shuttle launch than watching the Artemis II launch around the moon, even though that was amazing, because of where they were going.
If memory serves, there was only one abort criteria in the shuttle when they didn't abort to orbit, but I'm not sure if I'm correct with that.
There was a million things that could happen, not a million, but many things that could happen that would have you abort back to the Kennedy Space Center. Really bad things, you could abort to a landing site up the East Coast, depending on your inclination. You could abort to Europe. We had landing sites for the shuttle in Europe and North Africa. Zaragoza, Spain, Morón, Spain, Estes in France, Gambia, and Ben Guerir, I'm sorry, in Morocco. So we had these sites. And also in the shuttle, you could abort back to the Kennedy Space Center by flying around the Earth. The
Oh
best
yeah,
abort is the abort to orbit. That's really
yeah,
where you want to abort to. But it wasn't the only one. It's the only one that they ever did. I think
yeah.
one time it was technically an AOA,
No,
ATO,
I think,
abort to orbit.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think I remember Scott Manley covering something off on that. But
Mm.
interesting. In terms of the Artemis as a spacecraft, obviously we had one. Test of the Orion capsule where it did go a free return trajectory around the moon. But as you say, this was different. Let me ask you this question. What is it that you can't really test on the ground that you're only going to test when you get into space?
Well, there's hardware tests you could do on the ground in a very controlled environment, but you're not in microgravity. You're not in the temperature extremes in sunlight versus shadow that you have a temperature change of, I don't know, 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Uh, I mean, some of that stuff you can do on the ground, but it's not the same as when you put it all together and expect systems to work in the environment that they were designed to. As an example, like motors, pumps, things like that, they don't always operate the same way without gravity. Uh, there's issues with how fluids behave in microgravity. And then there are the unknown things you don't even think about when you're flying for the first time in a spacecraft. So I'm sure they learned a lot. But to really understand how something works, you have to flight test it. You
Yeah.
can't just do everything on the ground.
As a shuttle pilot previously, looking at the Artemis hardware and how the flight controls are configured. Obviously, there's a lot more automation these days, a lot more compute power applied. But what would you say as a pilot is the difference in experience in terms of flying an Orion spacecraft versus the old shuttle days, even with the sort of enhanced flight display systems and stuff like that in the later generations of the shuttle?
Well, the space shuttle, you could fly kind of like an airplane in the atmosphere. You pull back on the stick, the nose goes up. You push down, it goes down. Turn left, turn right with a stick, that kind of thing. And capsule doesn't have the same flying
Respond like that.
qualities. I mean, you could imagine it's more of the shape of a rock. And yeah, it doesn't have not only the flying qualities and the ability to control its trajectory as well as you can on the space shuttle, but the spacecraft itself doesn't have the flexibility of mission that the space shuttle had. I mean, theoretically, you could do a spacewalk from an Orion capsule, um, but you wouldn't be able
But
to do
everyone
this
else is going
type.
to have to suit up, and yeah.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be able to do the stuff that you did from the space shuttle to have that kind of flexibility. Also, the science capability is not the same, and the space shuttle can, generate more power, has more room. So you're very limited in that regard. But like the Soyuz, I mean, when you design something to do like one or two things, oftentimes it's better at those one or two things than if you design something to do many things, because you can't design for all of those things to be done
Yeah.
perfectly. So stuff like going to orbit and coming back or going to the moon, the space shuttle could never go to the moon. It's not possible.
True.
People always like, why can't you send the space shuttle to the moon? It's too heavy. It weighs like 10 times what Orion weighed, you
And
know?
if you landed it, well, how are you going to take off again, right? It's
Oh, there's that. I'm talking about just even flying around the moon.
yeah.
I've had people ask me, "Hey, where did you land? Where's the runway on the moon that you landed the space shuttle?" I'm like, "It's in Florida."
What was it like? When you returned from orbit in the shuttle, you have to do these S turns to slow down, right? Isn't it before you do your like once you come through the aero braking maneuver, and what was that like?
Well, you're not doing them to slow down. You're doing them more to control your cross range
Right.
and your trajectory. I mean, you'll be like this, and then next time you're like, I mean, it's like doing a steep turn in an airplane. The difference is you might be at 50 miles going 17,500 miles an hour, and it just makes you think you're really low. I remember my first flight, Kurt Brown, the commander of the space shuttle, 1999 mission to fix the Hubble Space Telescope. He says, as we're going to land in Florida, and we've just come out of darkness after the deorbit burn, so you're not hitting the atmosphere yet, but you're at like 50 miles of altitude. So we went from like 400 miles Hubble altitude down to 50, going the same speed. And he says, man, looks like we're really low. He was kidding, saying, hey, looks like we might not make it to Florida, kind of as a joke because you're so low. And I said, yeah, but we got a lot of smack, meaning, we're going 17,500 miles an hour.
It's true. Yeah, you chew up a lot of space.
Yeah, a capsule's much more dynamic than the space shuttle coming back because, when the parachute opens and your deceleration, and it's just very dynamic, intense environment. Space shuttle's more like, driving a Rolls Royce down Park Avenue compared to a capsule reentry, which is a much more medieval experience, I think. The sections are exploded apart, and
coming through the plasma with the heat shield ablating, and then like those parachutes, the tech in those parachutes opening at the speeds they open is pretty impressive.
It's like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, but while you're on fire, and as soon as you realize you're not going to die. It's the most fun you've ever had in your entire life.
Well, so you returned in the Soyuz, didn't you, from orbit?
Yeah.
From the ISS? Yeah. So that
a couple times. It's crazy. If I hated being in space for a whole year, I'd do it all over again for the last 20 minutes.
Pretty uncomfortable, the seating in the Soyuz, right, with the knees up at your chest and so forth.
Yeah. I think in Orion they had a little bit more room than the Soyuz. It's basically the smallest position you could possibly put your body in, sitting in a seat. Extremely painful to do it for a really long time, to be strapped in.
Even though the seat is made to your specific specifications, right?
Yeah, the seat and the suit. Yeah, it's still painful. I mean, when you're like joints, especially like if you have any like osteoarthritis or knee pain or anything, or back pain for that matter, when you're fixed in a position and you physically can't move for a long period of time, like you can't even move your knee or your feet a little tiny bit, that can be extraordinarily painful.
Yeah, Russia just announced the Soyuz 5. So increased payload capacity and more advanced propulsion and better engine. So it'll be, I'm looking at the specs. It doesn't say it's particularly larger inside. So
they announce all kinds of stuff that never happens. We do that too, though.
Yeah, true. Well, I mean, this is where it gets interesting. Artemis III was originally supposed to put boots back on the moon, but now it's going to be an orbital exercise, rendezvousing with the potential landers, whether that is Blue Moon or the Starship. Blue
Moon is a beer. Blue Origin is a spacecraft made by Blue Origin, but
I know that. But isn't the Shepard's the stack? But isn't the lander called Blue Moon? I could be wrong. I
don't know.
Wrong, but
I'm sure Blue Moon would love that.
They could sponsor it.
One time I tweeted a picture with a glass that was a Blue Moon glass with beer in it, and I don't even know. Maybe we said something about it. That company sent me like cases of beer and some beer steins.
That's a pretty good deal. All right, let's talk about the ISS as a prototype for lunar civilization, because we are looking at now building a base on the moon. So what of it from a construction perspective, and I'm not sure how many of the missions you're on to the ISS where active construction was done, but how much of what we learned in putting together the ISS in orbit is relevant for experience in building a lunar base?
I think there's a lot of relevance. I mean, certainly the suits. Again, the moon has some gravity, so they need to be designed differently to with that in mind. How the hardware works in microgravity is different than in gravity can be. The lunar dust really problematic. Um, but I think a lot of the tools, the procedures, the discipline, the operational concepts, um, very, very similar. And the space station is over 1 million pounds that we built over, I mean, decades. Really remarkable
It
thing
is.
that we did. I think it was harder than going to the moon the first time. Um, and I guess it depends on the design of what kind of base we decide to build. I don't know how far along. I know some of the hardware that was going to be used for the lunar space station, in lunar orbit, is going to
It's
be
going to be
repurposed.
repurposed. Yeah. Gateway.
So I guess it depends on the design, how complicated it's going to be. We'll see.
I mean, in the NASA stuff and that I've seen, you've got gateway modules being repurposed. You've got
Yeah.
inflatable modules which have been tested, obviously, at the ISS,
Yeah.
and then they're proposing to topple a couple of starships over as well, potentially, because you get the living space from that. So there's a few different. I've seen a few different
You
proposals
mean land
out there.
something and then tip it over?
Yeah, yeah. So and then they can build up the lunar regolith on either sides of it to provide some protection, at least.
Yeah.
Because it's obviously when if it does land on the moon, it's going to be much larger than anything else we've ever put on the moon.
Yeah.
Or
I don't know
will
how
do.
I'd feel about being on that top of that thing, landing on the moon vertically. And the moon is like hundreds of feet below you.
Well, we even had issues with one of the recent commercial missions toppling over, with
Yeah, and that
being
thing
top heavy.
that thing wasn't all that tall either.
Yeah, yeah. So they're going to have to get that right.
Yeah, right. Or not.
Absolutely.
Or you crash it and then you'd fly it
Yeah.
again and try again.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I guess that's going to be the process. Oh, having said that, SpaceX has been pretty good landing on these ocean barges. So if that's an indication of their ability to stay up, but you've got the lunar gravity to take into account.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the long duration mission stuff in terms of ISS. If we are going to the moon, and we're going to stay there, the crews are going to stay on the surface for longer periods of time. We have to figure out energy sources. Most likely, I've heard talks about putting RTGs back on the moon because of the length of the lunar day and night
Putting what?
cycles. Radioisotope thermoelectric generators.
Yeah. Nuclear
nukes, mini nukes.
Yeah.
And things like that, but enabling these longer duration missions. There are some similarities, but what do you think would be the difference in psychology from, going on the moon and staying there for weeks at a time and having to rely on that hardware versus with the ISS, where you always knew you could get in the Soyuz and you could come back to Earth at a moment's notice?
I think psychologically, when you're on the space station, it's not really distance that separates you from the Earth, it's physics. It's the fact that you're going really fast. Makes you feel like you're off the planet and somewhat isolated. But, we're only, a couple hundred miles above the the planet, and the moon is much, much further away. 240,000 miles away. Varies a little bit at times, but so I think it's more akin to maybe being on the summit of Everest if a problem happens, where on the space station, in a real serious emergency, I mean, you can get in the Dragon or the Soyuz and get home within a few hours, and you're days away from Earth if you're on the moon. So yeah, I think psychologically it would be different. I'm interested in finding out, like, if there's an inflection point with gravity, that if you have a little bit of gravity, your physiology will work just fine, and like bone loss and muscle loss is not as big of a concern.
Yeah.
The things that affect us in microgravity when you're there for a long period of time may not, well, certainly probably won't be as bad, but it would be interesting to know, is there some kind of inflection point? Like, is 1/6 Earth's gravity enough? Maybe that's all we need. I don't know.
Yeah.
That'll be one of the differences.
I mean, it'll be good. It'll be a good test medically for how astronauts are going to survive on Mars as well. If we get to Mars, given the biochemistry and those sort of things as well. So
yeah.
Hey, listen, Scott. Let's take a quick break.
I think going to Mars will be more like getting on the Mayflower or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Than it is going to the space station.
Yeah, agree. Let's take a quick break, and then after the break, let's talk about some of the functional elements of moon-based design and what could go wrong. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm talking to Captain Scott Kelly. We'll be right back after this break. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support The Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to The Futurists. Back in the guest chair this week is Captain Scott Kelly. Spent almost a year on the International Space Station, at the time, it was the longest duration any U.S. astronaut had spent in orbit. And we're having a chat to him about the upcoming plans for NASA to return to the moon. Scott, given your experience on the ISS with repairing various elements of, the environment that you lived in, as an astronaut, what would you be looking for in preparation to return to the moon, in terms of things that could break in the functional environment?
The ascent engine, that's a big deal. I'd be concerned about that.
Yeah, I think that's true.
On Apollo, if that thing didn't light, game over.
I mean, it was really simple tech, right? Just mixing two chemicals together, but at the same time.
That's what's good about it. When you have an engine that doesn't require any source of ignition, as long as you can get these two chemicals mixed together at the proper amounts and that they'll ignite and lift you off the surface. Yeah, I'd be concerned about that, I would be concerned mostly about the stuff that can kill you right away. Like, as an example, like on the space station, we often had trouble, like, with the system that scrubbed the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere. Yep. It was very annoying. And over time, we made it better. That type of problem you have time to deal with. What you wouldn't have time to deal with are things like valve redundancy to vacuum, like to make sure that you're not going to quickly lose your pressurized volume because of some hardware failure. Certainly the engine that gets you off the moon, the one that gets you down to the surface, are very important. Yeah, Man, a lot of considerations when you're that far away from home. Redundancy management, how things fail, and then what you do to accommodate and how you react to those failures is very important. But I'd be looking, hard at the things that can kill you quick.
Yeah. In terms of crew resource management, as a commander, what training are you put through in terms of watching the mental health of the crew, and how would that potentially play out on the moon?
Before a space station, like a long duration mission, you spend a lot of time with psychologists and psychiatrists, talking about not only your own mental health, but how your crew gets along. You do that in space. Um, I think it'd be very similar to the space station. The difference, like we discussed, is just the psychological aspect of not being a few hours away from the surface in the case of emergency. I mean, you're many days, but as a team, you look out for each other. Just like hopefully like family members would. If you see someone struggling, you ask them about it. Ask them if there's anything they could do to help. Suggest that they speak to someone, a professional. So it's all the logical things you would expect from a group of people living together.
With this shift, clearly commercial partners are a big part of the program to return to the moon's surface. Previously, particularly in the Gemini missions, in the Apollo missions, the astronauts were deeply involved in refining systems on the spacecraft. Is that still, like with the Dragon capsule, for example, with astronauts, going to the ISS today? How much involvement does the crew today have in the actual hardware, and how's that changed since the earlier days?
Well, in the case of Dragon, I think it wasn't like the space shuttle. I mean, the space shuttle, even though it was built by Rockwell, we gave them design requirements, but we were also very much involved in how those requirements were met. SpaceX was built much differently, where it kind of built in a vacuum a little bit with where NASA didn't have a whole lot of insight into the individual system designs and such, but that was intentional. Because we gave them money, we gave them requirements, and you said just give us a product. I think Orion was handled
streamline production, at least.
Yeah, and to say cost savings. I think Orion was handled a little bit differently. There was much more crew involvement. I think the displays were mostly made in house in the astronaut office. As a matter of fact,
Oh, wow.
developed a lot of the displays. One of my classmates, very involved in that for decades, Lee Morin, producing interfaces for spacecraft, and but Dragon was different.
How much do you use AI in your daily life these days? ChatGPT, Claude, that sort of
Do
stuff.
I use it?
Yeah.
I use it all the time. I use it for
So given that, how would you see AI being integrated into lunar hardware? How would you be looking to use it from a design perspective?
I don't really know, because I don't use it in that kind of context. I just use Chat GPT as a fake person to bounce ideas off and get information from. I would imagine there are certain. Well, as an example, on the space station, if you had like some kind of AI agent managing your schedule throughout the day and kind of guiding you through all the different procedures and the timeline, I could see that being very beneficial. Certainly, in the absence of the ground, if you had maybe an internally hosted AI system where all the information from all the hardware on board, the schematics, everything was incorporated, and that was just resident on
Problem
board.
solving. Yeah.
Yeah, where you could say, "Hey, we had this. What are the?" You could just use it as a on-site mission control where, when we're on the space station or launching on a rocket, not only is there mission control in Houston, there's also one in Florida where you launch, but there's also, for each console position, there's a back room of people at NASA, and their back room, it might be in California where Rocketdyne builds the engines, and there's that back room. So you have all these hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands available at any time over the comm system. But maybe you don't need that with AI. Maybe you could make an AI that's resident on board that would have all the systems knowledge and experience and critical decision making resident on the spacecraft.
On the ISS, what was there some technology on station that you still sort of to this day was like, that's really impressive that people could build that, apart from the ISS itself, as you said, but a specific piece of technology which still amazes you that we're able to come up with it?
Well, the whole thing is just this remarkable engineering achievement, how it's put together and functions together. As far as individual systems are concerned, I was surprised. I was the first person to use that Microsoft HoloLens on board.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, it was the first time we used it, and it was big and clunky, but, on the space station, it didn't bother your neck because, it's floating your head, and, you don't have to, it wasn't uncomfortable to wear. I found that it had, even at that early stage, an incredible amount of potential. And I haven't heard anything about that thing in years.
Well,
I think Microsoft may have given up on it.
Well, no, they have sort of semi-retired it to some extent, but now you've got Oculus, obviously Meta built into the Ray-Bans and stuff like that. So
I had the Meta
presumably,
glasses. Yeah, I had the Ray-Ban Metas for a while.
Yeah.
And for me,
now they have the head-up display with the, it's like presumably, astronauts in their visor, is going to have that tech. Even just for temperature and oxygen, saturation, all that sort of stuff. Presumably, they're going to have those readouts, so they don't have to look at any gauges on their wrist or on their chest plate.
Yeah. I think flying something like HoloLens on board, it makes sense for developing the technology. An F-35 fighter plane, the crew members wear a $500,000 helmet.
Yeah, exactly.
That provides all the symbol. But for them, they need that. I don't know if you really necessarily need that for normal ops in space, but I found like that HoloLens is very helpful where you just have it on and you could see procedures in your screen, and you have a camera and the ground is looking at stuff you're looking at, and they can even write things in your field of view. Like you're looking for a part on a piece of hardware and you can't seem to find it, and the guy on the ground could just circle it in your field of view. It was
That's pretty cool.
Incredible amount of potential. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. Let's talk about how long duration missions, how it changed you, but also how you think being on the moon might take that to the next level. We've talked about the overview effect and all of that on the last show, and we even talked about that on stage in Dubai. But how do you think your perception of the Earth has changed since your time in space, and how do you think that might be the case for those astronauts who end up on the moon?
I think on my experience, low Earth orbit, space shuttle, space station, flying on the Soyuz, you learn a few things. You learn that humans are incredibly capable of doing some remarkable things, positive things. If they put their minds to it, if they work together cooperatively, if they work with people the case like the Russians that we're not even friends with anymore, and were our enemies, and now we're able to do something extraordinary with them. I think there's a lot of life lessons in that, and that is to solve problems. You need to sometimes solve those problems with people you disagree with, and I think in the United States we need that philosophy a little bit more. But Earth, even from the space station, looks like this oasis in space. And I would imagine looking at Earth from the distances of the moon, especially when Earth is behind the moon and you could no longer see it, you realize just how wonderful and incredible and fortunate we are to have this planet. And we are all on it together, and we all need to take care of it. And, we're not as we are much more interconnected than we think. This really, the Earth is kind of like a spaceship. It's got life support systems. It's got power systems that, it's got the sun. It's got other ways to produce energy, and it has a crew. And to make a spacecraft work, you got to work together. To make this spacecraft work, you got to work together. I can't believe after, anyone 400,000 to, I don't know, 200 to 400,000 years ago of human evolution, we still haven't gotten away from killing one another.
I know,
It
it's
seems
frustrating,
like
isn't
it'd be
it?
a pretty easy decision. Hey, can't we just all agree not to kill each other anymore?
I'm for that. International cooperation was a big part of ISS's success. And obviously, the cost of returning to the moon is measured in tens of billions of dollars. So, given the geopolitics of the day, how would you, if you were a NASA administrator today, how would you be navigating international cooperation?
Well, if I was the NASA administrator today, we'd have a different administration. So there's that. Not that I have a desire to be the NASA administrator, but if I was, it wouldn't be under these conditions. But if I was, and the NASA administrator doesn't decide like what countries participate in the space program. I mean, that decision is for the legislative and executive branches of our government. But under different, if it was me and I was making the decision, I would allow people to become part of this that agree with our values in this country, at least the values that we think we should have and maybe had at one time. And, those values are things like human rights and due process and just, overall fairness. Just being cooperative and nice to each other to achieve a common goal. But I would look for partners that share those same kind of traditional values that this country has, values of democracy and freedom of speech, being able to criticize your government. Seems like we're getting away from that now.
Yeah, that's true.
Like it's crazy to where our government does things to people that you would expect from an authoritarian government when it comes to free speech.
Yeah, well, I know your brother has been impacted by that as well. Let's take these three questions in terms of priority. What operational lesson from the ISS becomes most critical when building a permanent lunar base?
I think the supply chain lessons are pretty important. I mean, in anything you do on Earth, and if you don't have a good supply chain, stuff starts to fail. So I think the logistics, supply chain stuff, even though much more complicated on the moon, still has applicability.
Perfect. In terms of long duration habitation, what problem do you think the public or policymakers still probably underestimate about the intent to go back to the moon permanently?
We always underestimate the cost.
Yeah,
Right?
it's true.
That's Yeah, always the case. Cost and schedule, always. We always have a more ambitious schedule, and we underestimate the cost of things.
Actually, that leads well into my last question as well. Is we're talking about Artemis being the beginning of human expansion in sort of a permanent foothold in space. But how realistic do you think that is, versus it becoming another temporary geopolitical cycle, versus really, returning or becoming a permanent presence? ISS has been a pretty good model for that, obviously gone for decades now, but what's it going to take to have something become a true permanent habitat versus something that's subject to geopolitical whims?
Well, it's my brother used to say when he was an astronaut, even, going to Mars or even the moon with a base, it's somewhat similar. Mars is much harder, but it's not about the rocket science. It's about the political science, meaning, you need the support, you need the money, you need the support of the people that elect the officials that believe in the program. We have a lot more things in this country that are more important than putting a base on the moon. But I think
Sure.
that is important, and it's worth the money to do it. But it's a balance. But it
I
is the
mean,
political
how
side.
do you answer that when people are saying, look, we have life expectancy decreasing again, we have child mortality rates in some U.S. states increasing again. Why should we go back to the moon? What's the answer?
Well, hopefully you can do more than one thing well, and my hope would be you can do those other things and still have a robust space program. Certainly in this country, we have huge problems with our debt and deficit, and there's only one way to solve that. And I don't know
Yeah.
why our government doesn't realize this or people, elected officials, don't realize it. There's one way. You raise taxes and you lower expenses. That's
Yeah.
it. Some people believe in this magic fairy of growing your way out of your problems, but I think historically that doesn't generally work.
I think
So,
Warren Buffett's solution is a pretty good one. His solution is that no U.S. senator or representative is allowed to be re-elected if the budget's running a deficit.
yeah,
I thought
that'd be a
that's
good
a
one.
pretty good
Yeah.
model. Or they get a limited period of time to address it.
And term limits, I think, are important.
Oh
Maybe
yeah,
not term limits where, you're limited to like 2 terms, but, being in the house for 30, 40 years. I don't know
yeah,
if anyone's been in for 40
yeah,
years, but there's been people like pushing 30. Uh,
yeah.
so,
You've your last mission to space was a while ago now.
at 10
If
years.
yeah, if they needed you to step up and be a commander of a 6-month mission to the lunar base in the future, would you consider it?
So yeah, sure, I would consider it. Would they need me? No. Am I the best person for the job? No. Uh, should I do it? No. Would I do it? Absolutely.
All right, awesome,
I'm pretty sure they're not going to call me.
awesome.
I mean,
Well,
Jared Isaacman's got my phone number and my hasn't rang yet.
did you meet him during the
Yeah, I
Artemis
met him.
when
I
you went to
flew
the
in
moon?
one of his airplanes with him. I went up
Oh,
to
nice.
Montana and flew in the back of his Alpha Jet with him.
Oh,
And
that's nice.
yeah, my wife was in the
He
other.
seems like, oh really? That's awesome for her.
He's a great guy. Yeah,
Yeah, he seems
he's
like
the
a
perfect
really
guy to
nice
be
guy.
NASA administrator right now.
Yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, I think the fact that he's actually, as a private individual, sponsored himself into space, did the first commercial spacewalk, certainly qualifies him.
Man,
So,
he's a believer.
yeah, he is absolutely. Well, listen, Captain Scott Kelly, thank you for joining us on the Futurists. Just coming up in the next few months, anything interesting on the schedule for you?
Next few months, my summers are pretty slow, but we're going to take a trip to Europe,
Nice.
Sweden. We're going to go to Rome and a few other places, but nothing
Awesome.
too exciting. I live a boring life here in my greenhouse.
Says the guy who spent a year in space.
Man.
Well, thank you very much,
right.
Scott. Nice greenhouse, by the way.
Oh, it's really impressive.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time again. It's good to catch up with you again. My regards to your lovely wife, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me, Brett.
That's it on The Futurist this week. You know how it ends. Please make sure if you like the show, leave us a 5-star review, tell your friends about us, share the episode, and we'll see you in the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.